The rain hammered against the windshield like artillery fire, each drop exploding in a spray that the worn wipers couldn't quite clear. James Mitchell's knuckles were white against the steering wheel of his 10-year-old pickup truck, the foreclosure notice folded in his shirt pocket, feeling heavier than the field pack he used to carry through the mountains of Afghanistan. Final notice. Delinquent. Vacate. The words had burned themselves into his mind 3 hours ago when he'd found the paper wedged in his front door like a death sentence. He was 38 years old, a decorated Army medic who had saved lives in places most people couldn't pronounce, and he couldn't keep a roof over his daughter's head. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth, bitter and metallic familiar from those long nights in field hospitals, when everything that could go wrong did. In the rearview mirror, Emma sat perfectly still in her booster seat, a small statue carved from silence and grief. 8 years old, with her mother's soft brown hair and eyes that had once sparkled with curiosity, now she stared out at the storm-lashed world without really seeing it. She wore the red dress today, the one Sarah had bought her last Christmas, the one that had become her armor against a world that had taken her mother away 10 months ago. Not a single word had passed her lips since the funeral. Not one. The mountain road twisted through dense Montana pine forest, each turn revealing another stretch of treacherous asphalt that seemed to mirror the path his life had taken since Sarah's accident. Black ice, they'd said. She never had a chance. The words of the state trooper still echoed in quiet moments, competing with the sound of Emma's silence, which had become a living thing in their house, pressing down on every conversation he tried to start, every bedtime story he attempted to tell. James had been a good soldier once. He'd known how to follow orders, how to save lives under impossible circumstances, how to lead men through chaos and bring them home alive. But civilian life was a different kind of war, one fought with the mortgage payments and medical bills, and the kind of enemies that couldn't be defeated with training or courage or any of the skills the Army had taught him. The VA disability check barely covered groceries. The part-time construction work had dried up when the economy turned sour. And now this final indignity, losing the little ranch house that Sarah had loved so much, the one place that still smelled like her perfume in the master bedroom closet. He'd spoken with therapists, with school counselors, with anyone who might have answers about Emma's condition. Dr. Patricia Coleman, a kind woman with gentle eyes and endless patience, had explained that trauma could manifest in many ways, that some children retreat into silence as a protective mechanism. Understanding the cage, she'd said, was the first step toward finding the key. But James felt like he was fumbling in the dark, and every day that passed without hearing his daughter's voice was another day of failure as a father. The turn came up faster than expected in the driving rain. James took it too aggressively, the truck's worn tires fighting for purchase on the slick asphalt. For a terrifying moment, they hydroplaned the world, spinning slightly as physics took control. He corrected with the smooth precision of someone who'd driven through worse conditions in worse vehicles, his heart hammering against his ribs with familiar adrenaline. That's when the headlights caught it, a shape in the road ahead, large and dark against the streaming pavement. An animal massive and still lying directly in their path. James slammed the brakes. The truck groaned and shuddered, anti-lock brakes chattering as they fought to bring 1,500 pounds of steel and momentum to a controlled stop. They slid to a halt perhaps 10 feet from the creature hazard lights, automatically clicking on, painting the scene in rhythmic amber pulses. It was a German shepherd lying on its side in the middle of the road. Even in the storm, James could see it was a beautiful animal. Its coat a striking mix of charcoal gray and pristine white. Adult, powerfully built, probably 70 or 80 pounds. But something was wrong with one of its front legs, bent at an unnatural angle. Every instinct told him to drive around it, to get Emma home, and try to deal with his own problems without taking on someone else's wounded animal. But the medic in him, the part that had never quite learned to ignore suffering, was already unbuckling his seatbelt. The rain was shockingly cold when he stepped out of the truck, soaking through his flannel shirt in seconds. He approached the dog slowly, hands visible, voice low and calm in the way he'd learned worked with both wounded soldiers and frightened animals. "Easy there, boy. Let me take a look at you." He expected the dog to be afraid, maybe aggressive. Wounded animals were unpredictable, driven by pain and instinct. This one was different. As James knelt beside it, the German shepherd lifted its head and looked directly into his eyes. There was intelligence there, a kind of assessment that seemed almost human in its intensity. No fear, no aggression, just a steady measuring gaze that seemed to be taking James's measure. The dog's injury was clearly painful, but its breathing was steady, its eyes alert. James had seen enough trauma to know this wasn't a fatal wound, just something that would need veterinary attention. He was reaching for his phone to call animal control when the German Shepherd did something extraordinary. It pushed itself up onto three legs with careful, deliberate movements. Despite the obvious pain, its posture was dignified, almost military in its bearing. It looked down the dark road ahead, then back at James, holding his gaze for a long moment that felt like communication. Then, with the kind of purposeful movement that spoke of mission rather than wandering, it began to limp toward the edge of the forest. After perhaps 20 steps, it stopped and looked back over its shoulder. The message was as clear as any spoken order James had ever received in the army. "Follow me." James stood in the rain, the truck's engine idling behind him, its headlights cutting lonely paths through the downpour. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to get back in the truck, to drive away from this strange encounter, and focus on his own overwhelming problems. Emma was waiting silent and patient in her red dress. The foreclosure notice was still in his pocket. He had responsibilities, failures to address, a life to somehow salvage from the wreckage of the past 10 months. But something in the dog's stance, in the way it waited with infinite patience at the forest's edge, spoke to a part of James that had been dormant since Afghanistan. This wasn't the behavior of a lost pet or an injured animal seeking help. This was purpose, mission, the kind of focused intention he'd seen in soldiers who knew exactly where they were going and why. The German Shepherd stood at the tree line like a gray and white sentinel, rain streaming from its thick coat, its intelligent eyes fixed on James with unwavering patience. In that gaze, James saw something he hadn't felt in months, maybe years. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with bills or therapy sessions or the crushing weight of his own inadequacy as a provider and protector. He looked back at the truck, at Emma's small silhouette in the amber glow of the hazard lights. He could return to that warm, dry cab drive home to their empty house and spend another evening in the suffocating silence of their shared grief. Or he could take one step towards something unknown, something that might lead nowhere but felt more like forward motion than anything he'd experienced since Sarah's death. The dog waited a study in canine patience and determination. When James finally began walking toward the forest, the German Shepherd turned and began its careful three-legged progress into the darkness between the trees, pausing every few steps to ensure its human companion was following. James had taken perhaps a dozen steps into the forest when he realized Emma was behind him. She climbed out of the truck without a sound, her red dress a bright splash of color in the gloom, and was following them with the kind of quiet determination she'd inherited from both her parents. She didn't speak, didn't call out, just walked in his footsteps as they followed the wounded dog deeper into the Montana wilderness. The forest swallowed the sound of the storm, replacing the harsh drumming of rain on metal with the softer whisper of water dripping from pine needles and the squelch of their footsteps in the muddy forest floor. James pulled out his phone, its flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the pressing darkness, but even that small light seemed inadequate against the vast blackness that surrounded them. The German Shepherd moved with an efficiency that contradicted its injury. Where James expected to see the clumsy progress of a wounded animal, he instead witnessed something that looked remarkably like tactical movement. The dog avoided dense undergrowth, used fallen logs as bridges over muddy patches, and seemed to navigate by an internal map that accounted for terrain concealment and the capabilities of its human followers. This wasn't random wandering. This was route navigation, the kind of purposeful movement James recognized from his military training. The dog was leading them somewhere specific, and it was doing so with the kind of operational security that suggested whatever lay ahead was worth protecting. They walked for nearly an hour, James carrying Emma, when the terrain became too difficult for her shorter legs, the German Shepherd maintaining its steady pace despite its obvious pain. The forest around them grew denser, older the trees, massive Douglas firs, and ponderosa pines that formed a canopy so thick that even James's flashlight seemed dimmed by comparison. When the dog finally stopped, they were on a steep hillside covered in what looked like impenetrable forest. Ancient trees rose like cathedral pillars around them, their trunks disappearing into the darkness above. James swept his light across the terrain, seeing nothing but moss-covered rocks, fallen logs, and the endless repetition of bark and shadow that characterized old-growth forest. The German Shepherd sat at the base of what appeared to be a large moss-covered boulder, looking up at James with that same patient, intelligent expression. Emma moved closer to the dog, her small hand finding its way into the thick fur around its neck, the first spontaneous affection James had seen her show toward any living thing since her mother's death. That's when she spoke. Her voice was rusty, with disuse barely above a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound James had heard in 10 months. His name is Ranger, isn't it, Daddy? The words hit James like a physical blow. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at his daughter as she continued to stroke the dog's fur with gentle, unconscious movements. Tears blurred his vision, hot and sudden and overwhelming. How do you know that he managed to ask? Emma looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her 8 years' wisdom born from months of silent observation and internal processing. He told me, she said simply. Not with words, but I could tell. James knelt beside his daughter, his hand joining hers in the thick fur of the German Shepherd they now knew as Ranger. The dog submitted to their attention with the grace of an animal accustomed to human contact, but there was something in its bearing that suggested this was more than simple domestication. This was partnership, the kind of bond James had seen between working dogs and their handlers in the field. Emma continued to pet Ranger, her voice growing stronger with each word she spoke. He's been waiting a long time, Daddy. Waiting for someone to find him. Waiting for us. As if responding to her words, Ranger rose and moved to the moss-covered rock face behind them. With his good front paw, he began pushing aside curtains of hanging vegetation, revealing what James had initially mistaken for natural stone formation. As more of the moss and ferns were cleared away, a straight line became visible, too perfect to be natural, running horizontally across the rock face for perhaps 12 feet. James brought his flashlight closer, his heart beginning to race with the recognition of human engineering. It wasn't a rock face at all. It was a wall constructed from some kind of composite material that had been designed to blend seamlessly with the natural stone of the hillside. The moss and small plants growing on its surface weren't random growth, they were part of an incredibly sophisticated camouflage system. He stepped back, trying to comprehend the scale of what he was seeing. As his eyes adjusted and his perspective shifted, the hillside itself began to reveal its secret. What he'd taken for a natural slope covered in forest growth was actually a structure, a building that had been integrated so perfectly with the landscape that it was virtually invisible from any distance greater than arm's reach. This wasn't some forgotten hunter's cabin or abandoned mining claim. The level of engineering, the sophistication of the concealment, spoke of massive resources and meticulous planning. Whoever had built this had intended for it to remain hidden indefinitely, a secret that would survive decades or even centuries without detection. Ranger had moved to a specific spot on the camouflaged wall, his nose indicating a small depression in the composite material. James pressed his hand against it and felt it give slightly, some kind of hidden mechanism responding to pressure. There was a soft hiss like the release of pressurized air, and a section of the wall swung inward on silent hinges. The air that greeted them wasn't the stale, musty atmosphere of an abandoned building. It was cool, dry, and clean, carrying the faint scent of cedar and old books. James stepped across the threshold, Emma's hand in his Ranger limping beside them with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The interior was beyond anything James had imagined. A single large room, but furnished with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of both comfort and purpose. A handmade bed occupied one corner, its wool blankets precisely folded. A simple wooden table and chairs sat in the center of the space. Built-in bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on subjects ranging from theoretical physics to American history. Everything was immaculately preserved, covered with only the thinnest layer of dust that spoke of years rather than decades of stillness. It was impossible, James thought. No structure, regardless of how well built, should have maintained this level of preservation through Montana winters and summers without constant maintenance. But it was the desk that drew his attention, a sturdy wooden workspace positioned beneath a window that was completely obscured by the vegetation growing outside. Unlike everything else in the room, the desk's surface was completely clean, as if it had been used recently. A leather-bound journal lay open upon it, a fountain pen resting beside it, as though the writer had simply paused mid-thought. James approached the desk with the reverence of someone entering a shrine. The handwriting on the open page was elegant and precise, the kind of penmanship that belonged to an earlier generation when writing was considered an art form. October 15th, 2004. The molecular lattice is finally stable. After 18 years of theory and countless failures, it holds. The energy density exceeds even my most optimistic calculations. A single unit no larger than a car battery could power a home for an entire year. The implications are staggering. We could end our dependence on fossil fuels. We could provide clean, unlimited energy to every corner of the globe. We could heal the planet. I feel like Prometheus having stolen fire from the gods. But unlike that mythological figure, I understand the responsibility that comes with such power. The question is no longer whether we can harness this energy, but whether humanity is ready for what it represents. James's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was reading. This wasn't the journal of some eccentric inventor or forgotten researcher. This was documentation of a scientific breakthrough that could revolutionize human civilization. He turned to the front of the journal, finding the owner's name embossed in gold letters on the inside cover, Dr. Samuel Carter. The name meant nothing to James, but as he continued reading, the scope of Carter's achievement began to dawn on him. The early entries were filled with the excitement of discovery, detailed descriptions of molecular manipulation and energy storage that were beyond James's understanding, but clearly represented years of groundbreaking research. Then the tone began to change. March 8, 2005. I was approached today by representatives from Nexus Corporation, polite men in expensive suits who claimed to be interested in funding my research. I was flattered at first until I realized the nature of their business. Nexus is one of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world. Why would they want to fund technology that could render their entire industry obsolete? April 22, 2005. The representatives returned, but their offer had changed. No longer were they interested in funding my research. Now they wanted to purchase everything: the patents, the prototypes, the research data. They used words like market stabilization and managed transition, but their meaning was clear. They didn't want to develop this technology. They wanted to bury it. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He was beginning to understand why this place existed, why it had been hidden so carefully. Dr. Carter hadn't just been protecting his research from theft, he'd been protecting it from deliberate suppression. May 15th, 2005. It is no longer a polite negotiation. They are pressuring my suppliers, questioning my colleagues, making it clear that cooperation would be in everyone's best interest. I see their strategy now. They cannot allow this technology to reach the market. It would destroy their trillion-dollar industry overnight. I have made my decision. If they want to bury my life's work, they will have to find it first. Emma had been exploring the room while James read, her natural curiosity overcoming months of withdrawal. She was standing beside one of the bookshelves, her finger tracing the spines of the volumes when she called out softly, "Daddy, look at this." She was pointing to a journal that was different from the others, thicker and bound in dark leather. The word sanctuary was embossed on its spine in the same elegant script as Carter's name. James carefully removed it from the shelf and opened it to the first page. This wasn't a personal diary, but a technical log filled with architectural drawings, engineering specifications, and construction notes. As James read, he began to understand the true scope of what Carter had accomplished. August 12, 2002. The exterior shell is complete. My polymer composite material is performing beyond expectations. The native moss and vegetation are already establishing themselves on the northern exposure. Within 5 years, this structure will be indistinguishable from the natural hillside. September 3, 2002. The internal systems are online. Climate control, air filtration, and water recycling are all functioning perfectly. The geothermal tap is providing consistent energy for basic operations, but once the first prototype is complete, this facility will be entirely self-sufficient. James flipped through pages of technical specifications, his military training, helping him understand some of the engineering concepts. Carter hadn't just built a hidden laboratory, he'd created a completely self-contained ecosystem designed to operate independently for decades without outside support or maintenance. November 7, 2003. Prototype 7 is stable and producing consistent output. It is now powering the entire facility, including the advanced life support systems. Based on current decay rates, it should continue to do so for approximately 50 years without any intervention. This sanctuary is now truly autonomous. The scope of Carter's genius was becoming clear. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a demonstration of the very technology it was designed to protect. The clean air, the perfect preservation, the flawless operation of complex systems after more than 20 years, all of it was powered by Carter's revolutionary energy source. Ranger had made himself at home on a braided rug near what James now realized was a sophisticated heating system disguised as a traditional fireplace. The dog was watching them with the same patient intelligence, but there was something in his bearing that suggested they had only seen the beginning of what this place contained. Emma had found something else, a small wooden box sitting on one of the shelves. Inside, nestled in velvet padding, was a metal collar, tarnished with age, but beautifully crafted. She brought it to James, her eyes bright with curiosity. "There's writing on it," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word she spoke. James examined the collar carefully, using his flashlight to illuminate the engraved script. As he cleaned away decades of tarnish, elegant letters became visible. Ranger, faithful companion to Samuel Carter, born 2003. The words hit James like a physical blow. Born 2003. He did the mental calculation, his hands beginning to shake. That would make this dog 22 years old. It was impossible. Ranger was clearly in the prime of his life, a powerful, healthy animal with the strength and stamina of about a quarter of that age. But as James looked into Ranger's intelligent eyes, he began to understand that nothing about this place, nothing about this discovery, was going to follow the rules of normal possibility. Dr. Samuel Carter had created something that went beyond revolutionary energy technology. He had unlocked secrets that challenged the very foundations of biological science. And somehow James Mitchell, a struggling veteran with a traumatized daughter and a pocket full of unpaid bills, had become the inheritor of the most dangerous and valuable secret in human history. The weight of that realization settled over him like a physical burden as Emma continued to pet Ranger, her laughter echoing softly in the impossible sanctuary that would change all their lives forever. The discovery of Ranger's impossible age should have been the most shocking revelation of the night, but as James stood in Dr. Samuel Carter's impossibly preserved sanctuary, holding the tarnished collar that defied every law of biology, he understood. He realized they had barely scratched the surface of what this place contained. Emma continued to stroke Ranger's thick fur, her newfound voice growing stronger with each word she spoke, as if breaking her 10-month silence had unlocked something fundamental within her. "This place feels alive, Daddy," she said, her 8-year-old intuition grasping something that James's adult skepticism was still struggling to accept. "Can you hear it humming?" She was right. Now that she'd pointed it out, James could sense it too. A barely perceptible vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the entire structure was breathing with mechanical precision. The temperature was perfectly regulated, the humidity controlled to museum-quality standards, and there was an almost imperceptible current of fresh air that spoke of sophisticated ventilation systems hidden behind the rustic wooden panels. James moved back to Carter's desk, drawn by the wealth of information contained in those precise, handwritten pages. As he continued reading, the scope of the doctor's achievement began to overwhelm him. This wasn't just about revolutionary energy storage. Carter had created something far more comprehensive, a complete ecosystem that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible with human ingenuity and determination. January 3rd, 2006. They came again today. Not the polite men in suits this time, but professionals. I watched them through the perimeter sensors, mapping the approaches, testing the concealment. They found nothing, of course. The thermal signature is completely masked, and the electromagnetic shielding prevents any electronic detection. But their presence confirms what I already suspected. Nexus Corporation will never simply walk away from this technology. James felt his blood run cold as he read the entry. The corporate threat that had driven Carter into hiding more than 20 years ago was real, immediate, and apparently still active. As if responding to his growing unease, Ranger lifted his head from the braided rug, ears pricked forward in the alert posture of a sentry dog, detecting something beyond human perception. The German Shepherd rose carefully, favoring his injured leg, and moved to what James had initially taken for a simple wooden panel in the wall. With his good front paw, Ranger began pressing specific points on the wood in a deliberate sequence. The panel slid aside, revealing a sophisticated electronic console that looked like something from a military command center. Multiple screens flickered to life, displaying what appeared to be camera feeds from around the exterior of the sanctuary. James counted at least a dozen different viewpoints, all showing the dark forest from various angles, all enhanced with night vision technology that rendered the stormy landscape in eerie green detail. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, and other detection systems he couldn't identify were all feeding data to the central display. It was a complete surveillance network hidden so perfectly that they hadn't noticed so much as a single camera lens during their approach. Carter hadn't just built a hiding place. He'd created a fortress with intelligence-gathering capabilities that would have impressed James's military commanders in Afghanistan. But it was the red warning light flashing on the main console that made James's stomach drop into his boots. Motion detected Sector 7, multiple heat signatures approaching from the northeast. Estimated arrival in 8 minutes. Emma saw the change in his expression immediately. "What's wrong, Daddy?" Before James could answer, Ranger had moved to another section of the console, his paw activating a different display. This screen showed a wider view of the surrounding forest, and James could clearly see what the sensors had detected. Black SUVs, at least 4 of them moving through the forest with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military or paramilitary training. Armed figures in tactical gear were deploying from the vehicles, spreading out in a textbook search pattern that James recognized from his own military experience. "They found us," James whispered, his mind racing through possibilities. But even as he said it, he knew it shouldn't have been possible. They'd left no trail, made no electronic communications, done nothing that should have led anyone to this place. Ranger moved to yet another console, bringing up what appeared to be building schematics. The sanctuary was far more extensive than James had imagined. What he'd taken for a single large room was actually just the entrance to a multi-level underground complex. Storage areas, laboratories, living quarters, all connected by a network of corridors that extended deep into the mountain like the roots of some massive technological tree. The dog's intelligent eyes met James's, and somehow he understood the message. There was an escape route, but they needed to move immediately. The approaching forces would be at the sanctuary's perimeter in minutes. "We need to get deeper into the mountain," James said, scooping Emma into his arms. "Ranger, show us the way out." The German shepherd led them to what appeared to be a bookshelf, but when he pressed his paw against a specific leather-bound volume, the entire section swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. Emergency lighting activated automatically as they began their descent, casting long shadows on walls that transitioned from wood panels to bare rock to polished metal as they went deeper into Carter's hidden world. The staircase ended in a corridor that belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a mountain hideaway. Smooth metal walls, indirect lighting, and the kind of sterile cleanliness that spoke of advanced air filtration and climate control systems. Doors led off the main corridor at regular intervals, each marked with simple placards that hinted at the scope of Carter's operation. Laboratory, workshop, archive, communication center, medical bay. Ranger led them directly to the laboratory, and when the doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss, James felt his understanding of the possible expand once again. The space was enormous, carved directly into the living rock, and filled with equipment that looked decades ahead of anything he'd seen in civilian applications. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with devices he couldn't begin to identify. Complex machinery hummed quietly in climate-controlled enclosures, but it was the center of the room that captured James's attention completely. Arranged on pedestals like museum pieces were the prototypes, metallic cylinders of various sizes and configurations, each one representing a different stage in Carter's development of his revolutionary energy storage technology. Even powered down, they seemed to radiate potential, the promise of unlimited clean power that could transform human civilization overnight. The sound of explosions echoed through the mountain above them, muffled by tons of rock and steel, but unmistakably violent. The attack had begun in earnest, and whoever was leading it had come prepared for a siege. A new alarm began sounding, different in pitch from the perimeter warnings. This one was urgent, immediate, terrifying in its implications. Breach detected, multiple contacts, sanctuary compromised. Emma pressed closer to James, her small body trembling with fear, but her voice steady when she spoke. "Are they the bad people from Dr. Carter's journal?" "Daddy, yes, sweetheart. But we're going to get away from them." Ranger had moved to what appeared to be another concealed doorway, this one leading deeper into the mountain's heart. But as James approached, ready to follow the dog's lead, a different sound reached them through the complex's ventilation system. Footsteps measured and purposeful echoing through the corridors above. The attackers had breached the sanctuary's outer defenses faster than anyone should have been able to manage. Then James heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A voice crisp and authoritative, carrying clearly through the facility's communication system. Dr. Carter's guests can stop running now. There's nowhere left to go that I haven't already mapped. My name is Dr. Victoria Sterling, and I believe you have something that belongs to me. The voice was cultured, educated with the kind of confidence that came from absolute certainty. But there was something else in those measured tones, something that spoke of desperation barely held in check, and time running out for reasons James couldn't yet understand. Ranger's reaction to the voice was immediate and dramatic. The dog's entire body went rigid, a low growl building in his chest that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere animal instinct. His intelligent eyes were fixed on the speakers with an expression that James had never seen before, a mixture of recognition, pain, and something that looked almost like betrayal. "She's here," James whispered, understanding, flooding through him with cold clarity. The woman from Carter's photographs, his former colleague and partner, the one who had driven him into hiding and ultimately to his death in this mountain fortress. Dr. Victoria Sterling had come to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. But Ranger's reaction suggested something even more complex and disturbing. This wasn't just professional rivalry or corporate espionage. This was personal, intimate, a relationship that went deeper than James had imagined possible between a human and an animal, even one as extraordinary as Ranger. The footsteps were getting closer now, accompanied by the electronic chirping of sophisticated detection equipment and the low murmur of tactical communications. Sterling's team was moving through the facility with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. James made a decision that went against every protective instinct he possessed. Instead of fleeing deeper into the mountain, he moved toward the laboratory's main entrance, positioning himself between the approaching threat and his daughter. If Sterling wanted to talk, he would talk. But he would do it on his own terms as a soldier and a father, not as a victim caught hiding in the darkness. The laboratory doors slid open with their characteristic pneumatic hiss, and Dr. Victoria Sterling walked into the room as if she owned it. She was exactly as she appeared in Carter's photographs, but 20 years older and carrying herself with the kind of authority that came from wielding immense corporate power. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore a tailored business suit that was absurdly out of place in the underground laboratory, but somehow made her appear even more intimidating. But it was her face that captured James's attention and held it. She was beautiful in the way that intelligent, powerful women often were, with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. Yet there was something wrong with her appearance, a subtle asymmetry that became more noticeable the longer James looked at her. Her skin had a waxy quality that spoke of medical procedures and artificial preservation, and when she smiled, the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "James Mitchell," she said, consulting a tablet computer with casual efficiency. "Veteran of the Afghanistan conflict, recently widowed, currently facing foreclosure on your family home. You've had quite an evening, haven't you?" James kept his voice steady, his military training helping him maintain composure in the face of overwhelming disadvantage. "Dr. Sterling, I presume. You seem to know a lot about me for someone I've never met." Sterling's smile widened, but the expression was cold and calculating rather than warm. "Oh, but we have met in a sense. I've been watching this facility for more than 2 decades, waiting for someone to finally discover it. When our monitoring systems detected unusual electromagnetic signatures from this location earlier tonight, I knew that Samuel's sanctuary had finally revealed itself to someone worthy of his trust." She gestured around the laboratory with proprietary familiarity. "This technology, this research, it represents the culmination of work that Samuel and I began together many years ago. He may have thought he could hide it from me, but genius recognizes genius, Mr. Mitchell. I always knew that eventually someone would find what he left behind." Emma had been standing quietly beside James, but now she spoke up with the fearless directness of childhood. "You're the lady who made Dr. Carter sad, aren't you? That's why he had to build his special house and hide from you." Sterling's composure flickered for just a moment, genuine surprise crossing her features as she looked down at the 8-year-old girl who had spoken with such startling perception. And you must be Emma. Such an insightful child. Yes, I suppose I did make Samuel sad, though that was never my intention. Sometimes the pursuit of scientific advancement requires difficult choices. But it was her reaction to Ranger that revealed the true depth and complexity of the relationships that had shaped this underground drama. When Sterling's gaze fell upon the German Shepherd, her carefully maintained mask of corporate authority cracked completely. For a moment, she looked like nothing more than a woman seeing a beloved companion after years of separation. "Hello, my beautiful boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion that seemed genuine, despite everything else about her that felt calculated and cold. "You've grown so strong, so magnificent. I've missed you more than you could possibly know." Ranger's response was immediate and devastating in its implications. The dog that had shown nothing but calm intelligence and gentle loyalty since James had met him now backed away from Sterling with every sign of fear and revulsion. His ears flattened against his head, his tail tucked low, and that low growl continued to build in his chest like a warning of approaching storm. James felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. The regeneration technology that had given Ranger his impossible longevity and enhanced intelligence, the medical equipment hidden in the sanctuary's deeper levels, the personal photographs showing Carter and Sterling working together in happier times. Sterling wasn't just Carter's former colleague and corporate enemy. She was Ranger's creator, the scientist who had performed the original experiments that had transformed him from an ordinary dog into something unprecedented. And judging by Ranger's reaction, those experiments had not been conducted with the gentle care and ethical consideration that James had assumed from reading Carter's journals. The implications were staggering and horrifying. If Sterling had been willing to subject an innocent animal to untested and potentially dangerous procedures, what might she do to human beings if she gained access to the perfected regeneration technology that Carter had spent decades refining and safeguarding? "You're his mother," James said quietly, the words heavy with understanding and revulsion. "You created him, experimented on him, and then Carter took him away from you." Sterling's mask slipped back into place, but not before James caught a glimpse of something desperate and hungry in her eyes. "Samuel was always sentimental about the subject," she said with forced casualness. "He could never understand that scientific progress sometimes requires sacrifices from those unable to give informed consent. Ranger was my greatest success, the proof that biological enhancement was not only possible but practical and safe." But James was beginning to understand that whatever Sterling had done to Ranger, whatever experiments had created his extraordinary abilities, they had come at a cost that went far beyond the physical. The dog's terror in her presence spoke of trauma that ran deeper than mere medical procedures, and Carter's decision to hide both his research and his canine companion suggested that he had discovered something about Sterling's methods that had horrified him enough to abandon their partnership completely. The sound of approaching footsteps reminded James that Sterling had not come alone. Her team was positioning themselves throughout the facility, cutting off escape routes and establishing tactical superiority with professional efficiency. But it was what happened next that transformed the situation from desperate to catastrophic. A new voice echoed through the laboratory's communication system, older and gruffer than Sterling's cultured tones, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command in dangerous situations. "This is Robert Kane to any friendlies in the facility. You've got about 2 minutes before Sterling's people lock down all the exits. If you want to live through the night, you'd better move fast and follow my voice." Sterling's expression shifted from cold confidence to blazing fury in the space of a heartbeat. "Impossible," she hissed. "Robert Kane died in a car accident 3 years ago. We confirmed the death, attended the funeral, verified the burial." But even as she spoke, the lights in the laboratory began flickering in a specific pattern, and James recognized it immediately from his military training. Morse code spelling out a simple message that made his heart race with sudden hope. EMMA space, DAD space, THIS space, OUAY. Ranger had already moved, limping rapidly toward a section of the laboratory that James had dismissed as a solid wall. But as the dog approached, a hidden panel slid aside, revealing a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in dangerous places doing dangerous things. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion that seemed to surprise him as much as everyone else in the room. "My God, you look just like your mother did at that age." The words hit James like a physical blow, But before he could process their full implications, Kane was in motion with the fluid efficiency of someone half his age. A device in his hand emitted a high-pitched whine, and suddenly the laboratory was filled with thick choking smoke that made breathing difficult and visibility almost impossible. "Move," Kane shouted over the chaos. "Sterling's people have the main exits covered, but there's another way out if we can reach it before they regroup." James grabbed Emma's hand and followed Kane's voice through the smoke-filled darkness, Ranger limping alongside them with grim determination. Behind them, he could hear Sterling shouting orders to her team, her voice thick with rage and desperation as her carefully planned operation began to unravel. But as they stumbled through hidden corridors and emergency passages that Kane seemed to know as well as the layout of his own home, James realized that the evening's revelations were far from over. The man leading them to safety had called Emma by name, had spoken about her mother with intimate familiarity, and had appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right knowledge to save their lives. Robert Kane wasn't just a convenient ally who had arrived in the nick of time. He was family, and the implications of that connection would change everything. James thought he understood about his wife's past, his daughter's heritage, and the true scope of the conspiracy that had claimed Dr. Samuel Carter's life, and was now threatening to consume them all. The emergency tunnel that Robert Kane led them through was a masterpiece of engineering that rivaled anything James had seen in his military career. Hidden beneath Carter's sanctuary, it stretched for what felt like miles through the mountain's heart, lit by emergency strips that activated as they passed. The air was clean and temperature-controlled, speaking of ventilation systems that had been operating flawlessly for decades. Emma ran alongside them with the resilience that only children possess, her red dress bright against the sterile tunnel environment. But it was Kane himself who dominated James's attention as they moved through the underground passage. The man moved with fluid efficiency, his knowledge of the tunnel system complete and intimate. This wasn't someone who had stumbled upon Carter's escape route by accident. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing fainter, but not disappearing entirely. Sterling's team was professional enough to find the hidden entrance eventually, and when they did, the chase would resume with deadly earnestness. The tunnel began to slope upward after what James estimated was nearly 2 miles of underground travel. Kane finally slowed their pace and turned to face James with eyes that held depths of knowledge and sorrow that seemed impossible to contain in one lifetime. "There are things you need to understand about who you are and what you've inherited," he said quietly. "Sarah never told you the truth about her family because she was protecting you from a world she'd spent her entire childhood trying to escape." James felt his world shifting again, the way it had been shifting constantly since he'd first encountered Ranger. Sarah had been an only child, orphaned young with no family connections that extended beyond their small household. At least that's what she'd always told him. "Sarah was my daughter." Kane continued, his voice thick with emotion. "My only child, and I haven't seen her since she was 22 years old, the day she told me she was cutting all ties with the family business and starting a new life where no one would ever find her." The revelation hit James like a physical blow, but before he could process its full implications, Emma spoke up with startling directness. "That makes you my grandpa, doesn't it?" Kane's composure cracked completely at those words. He knelt down to Emma's level, his weathered hands gentle as they touched her face. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm your grandfather, and I've been watching over you from a distance since the day you were born. Your mother made me promise to stay away, but when I heard about the accident..." His voice broke then, and James saw the man he was beginning to understand was far more than just Carter's ally. Kane was family blood, family connected to them by bonds that Sarah had chosen to sever, for reasons James was only beginning to suspect. They emerged from the tunnel into a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, but James immediately recognized that this wasn't wilderness in any natural sense. The trees were positioned too perfectly, the entire area designed to provide concealment while allowing rapid movement. This was a staging area, a place where people could regroup while remaining invisible to surveillance. A cabin sat in the center of the clearing, and Kane led them inside to what could only be described as a tactical command center. Banks of monitors lined one wall showing camera feeds from dozens of locations. Communication equipment hummed quietly. Weapons were secured in locked cabinets with military precision. "This is where I've been coordinating the search for Carter's sanctuary for the past 3 years," Kane explained. "After his death, I knew Sterling would eventually find a way to locate his research. Carter and I had developed contingency plans, ways to ensure his work would survive, even if both of us were eliminated. But it was what Kane showed them next that demonstrated the true stakes they were facing. He activated a secure communication system, and suddenly the cabin was filled with voices from around the globe. Scientists in Geneva, intelligence operatives in Tokyo, corporate whistleblowers in Sao Paulo, all connected by encrypted channels. The Guardian Network, Kane explained as James listened to reports of Nexus Corporation activities on 6 continents. We've been operating for 15 years protecting researchers, exposing corporate crimes, and ensuring that breakthrough technologies reach the people who need them. Emma had been exploring the cabin with fearless curiosity, examining photographs that told the story of Kane's long career. But it was one photograph in particular that caught her attention, a picture of Kane with a young woman who looked remarkably like Emma herself. The woman was wearing a graduation cap and gown, her smile radiant. "That's your mother," Kane said softly. The day she graduated with her teaching degree, she was absolutely determined to build a life that had nothing to do with the world I'd raised her in. James stared at the photograph, seeing Sarah as she'd been before he met her, so young and optimistic, completely unaware of the tragedy that would eventually claim her life and leave her daughter orphaned, except for a grandfather she'd never known existed. The communication system crackled with an urgent transmission. "Kane here, go ahead." The voice that responded was crisp but tinged with concern. "Nexus Corporation teams are mobilizing globally. Sterling has activated assets in 12 countries and authorized unlimited expenditure for the recovery of Carter's research. She's launching a coordinated effort to eliminate anyone who might have knowledge of the regeneration technology." Kane's response revealed an even more disturbing truth. Sterling's condition is deteriorating faster than our medical consultants predicted. The cellular breakdown from her early exposure to the flawed regeneration process is accelerating. Our sources estimate she has less than 6 months before complete systemic failure. The implications were staggering. Sterling wasn't just fighting for power. She was fighting a biological clock, counting down to her death. And that desperation made her infinitely more dangerous than any corporate executive motivated merely by greed. Emma had been listening with serious attention, and now she spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of their situation. "If the lady is sick and the medicine can make her better, why don't we just give it to her?" Kane looked at James, recognizing that Emma had identified the central ethical dilemma they faced. They possessed technology that could save Sterling's life, but giving it to her meant putting it in the hands of someone who would use it for purposes Carter had died trying to prevent. The communication system suddenly erupted with alarms from multiple channels simultaneously. "Emergency, emergency, all Guardian stations. Nexus forces have surrounded the Montana safe house. Multiple helicopters inbound, estimated arrival 30 seconds. Kane was already moving his hands, flying over control panels, as automated systems began shutting down sensitive equipment. But even as he worked, James could hear the distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop of rotorcraft approaching fast and low through the forest canopy. Through the cabin windows, James saw them first. 3 black helicopters dropping into the clearing with military precision, their rotor wash bending trees and sending debris flying. Tactical teams were fast roping down before the aircraft had even touched ground, surrounding the cabin with overwhelming force. A voice boomed through external speakers, cultured and confident despite the chaos of the operation. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Dr. Sterling. I believe we have something that belongs to each other. I have your canine friend, and you have my life's work. Perhaps it's time we discussed a mutually beneficial exchange." James felt his blood turn to ice water. Through the tactical displays, he could see Sterling herself stepping down from the lead helicopter, and she wasn't alone. 2 of her operatives were carrying something between them, a transport crate just large enough to contain a large dog. Even from a distance, James could hear the muffled whimpering coming from inside. "They have, Ranger." Emma whispered, her voice breaking with the realization that their loyal guide was now a prisoner. But Sterling's next words transformed their desperate situation into something far worse. "I'm going to make this very simple," she announced through the speakers. "You have exactly 60 seconds to send the child out alone. Emma Mitchell will accompany me back to our facility where she'll be kept quite comfortable while her father considers my generous offer to trade her life for Carter's regeneration technology." The world seemed to stop for James. Everything he'd learned about being a soldier, a medic, a father crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. Sterling had just declared war not on him, but on his daughter, and that was a line that could never be uncrossed. Emma moved closer to him, her small hand finding his with surprising steadiness. "I'm not scared, Daddy," she said quietly. "But we can't let her hurt Ranger either." Kane had finished his equipment shutdown and was now opening weapon lockers with practiced efficiency. His face had transformed into something hard and dangerous, the expression of someone who had spent decades in situations where violence was the only language that mattered. "Sterling's playing a losing game," he said grimly. "She thinks desperation gives her advantages, but desperation makes people stupid. She's just told us exactly what she values most, which means we know exactly how to hurt her." Through the monitors, James could see Sterling consulting with her team, leaders pointing toward the cabin, and issuing orders with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the tactical advantages. But she'd made a fundamental error in her assessment of the people she was threatening. She saw a broken veteran, a traumatized child, and an aging intelligence operative. What she'd actually cornered was a combat medic who'd saved lives under fire, a remarkably resilient little girl who'd found her voice in the face of tragedy, and a man who'd spent his career making problems disappear for people who faced impossible odds. The 60-second ultimatum expired without response from the cabin, and Sterling's reaction was swift and decisive. Gas canisters arced through the air, crashing through windows and filling the space with choking smoke designed to incapacitate rather than kill. But Kane had been expecting exactly this response, and his countermeasures were already in motion. Filtration systems activated automatically, clearing the air almost as quickly as the gas could spread. Emergency exits that Sterling's team couldn't have detected from their aerial reconnaissance opened silently in the cabin's rear wall. And most importantly, the real tactical surprise that Kane had been saving for exactly this kind of situation came online with a high-pitched whine that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. "Electromagnetic pulse," Kane announced calmly as every piece of electronic equipment visible through the monitors died simultaneously. Helicopters, radios, night vision, all of it just became very expensive junk. The clearing plunged into relative darkness as the aircraft's lights failed and the tactical teams found themselves operating with nothing more than basic equipment and training. But Kane's preparations went deeper than simple electronic warfare. Hidden speakers throughout the forest began broadcasting confusing audio signals, making it impossible for Sterling's forces to coordinate through voice commands. Automated systems released chemical agents that wouldn't harm humans, but would overwhelm the scent tracking capabilities of any dogs they might have brought. In the space of 30 seconds, Sterling's overwhelming technological advantage had been neutralized, and the engagement had become a contest between training experience and raw determination. Those were odds that Kane seemed willing to accept. "Time to go," he said, handing James a compact assault rifle and Emma a small backpack that probably contained more advanced survival equipment than most military units carried. Sterling made one critical mistake in her planning. She assumed we'd be here when she arrived. As they slipped through the rear exit into the forest beyond, James could hear Sterling's voice rising in frustration and rage as she realized her carefully planned operation was collapsing around her. But it was what he couldn't hear that worried him most. No more whimpering from Ranger's transport crate. Either the dog had been moved or Sterling's desperation had driven her to use him as leverage in ways that James didn't want to contemplate. Kane led them through the forest with the same sure knowledge he'd demonstrated in the tunnel system, following paths that seemed invisible to James but were clearly well-established routes in the older man's mental map. Behind them, the sounds of Sterling's forces regrouping and adapting to their changed circumstances grew gradually fainter, but never disappeared entirely. "We need to reach the secondary facility," Kane explained as they moved through the darkness. Carter built multiple research sites, and this operation was never about just the sanctuary you discovered. Sterling knows about the main laboratory, but she doesn't know about the backup location where he kept his most sensitive work. Emma was keeping pace admirably, her small legs working hard to match the adult's longer strides. But it was her question that cut straight to the heart of their tactical situation. "Grandpa, if we go to the other place, how do we save Ranger?" Kane's answer revealed the true complexity of what they were facing and the terrible choice that Sterling's actions had forced upon them. "The regeneration technology your father found isn't the only device Carter created, sweetheart. But all of them have limitations that Sterling doesn't understand. There's only enough processed material for one complete treatment, And using it means choosing between saving Ranger's life and denying Sterling the cure she needs to survive. The weight of that revelation settled over James like a physical burden. They weren't just fighting to protect revolutionary technology from misuse. They were being forced to decide who would live and who would die, and that decision would define not just their own futures, but the course of human scientific advancement for generations to come. Sterling's desperation had created a situation where moral clarity was impossible, where every choice carried consequences that would haunt the survivors regardless of which path they chose. But as James looked at his daughter's determined face in the moonlight filtering through the forest canopy, he realized that some decisions couldn't be made by adults trying to calculate the greater good. Sometimes the right choice was simply the one that an 8-year-old girl could live with, and Emma had already made it clear that abandoning Ranger wasn't an option she was prepared to accept. The secondary facility that Kane led them to through the moonlit forest was built for one purpose: rapid deployment of assets when the primary location was compromised. Hidden in what appeared to be an abandoned mining operation, the real command center lay behind rusted equipment and deliberately collapsed tunnel entrances. But this wasn't another research laboratory. This was a staging area for offensive operations. Kane moved through the facility with grim efficiency, activating systems that revealed the true scope of the Guardian Network's capabilities. Communications equipment connected them to operatives across 6 continents. Weapons lockers contained hardware that most military units would envy. And most importantly, a detailed intelligence file on Nexus Corporation's Seattle headquarters lay spread across a planning table like a blueprint for invasion. "This is where we've been preparing for the endgame," Kane explained, as displays showed real-time surveillance of the Nexus building. "Sterling thinks she holds all the advantages, but she's made a fundamental error. She's retreating to her corporate fortress, surrounding herself with lawyers and board members who have no idea what kind of war they're about to become part of." Emma studied the architectural plans with the serious attention she'd been bringing to everything since her silence had broken. "It looks like a castle, Daddy. Are we going to attack the castle to save Ranger?" James felt his military training taking over as he examined the tactical situation. The Nexus headquarters was a 40-story glass and steel tower in downtown Seattle, surrounded by urban terrain that offered both opportunities and challenges for an assault team. Security would be extensive, but Kane's intelligence files showed weaknesses that could be exploited by people with the right knowledge and equipment. "Not attack, sweetheart," he corrected gently. "Infiltrate. We're going to walk right through the front door and confront Sterling in the place where she feels most powerful, most protected. And when we do, we're going to show her that all the corporate security in the world can't protect someone from the consequences of their own choices." Kane was coordinating with Guardian operatives around the globe, his weathered hands moving across communication controls with practiced precision. The plan he outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. James would present himself at Nexus headquarters as a willing participant in Sterling's board meeting, carrying what appeared to be Carter's regeneration technology in a briefcase designed to pass every security scanner the corporation possessed. But the device in the briefcase wouldn't be the real regeneration compound. It would be a decoy sophisticated enough to fool Sterling's technical experts long enough for James to get close to her, close enough to end this conflict on terms that honored Carter's vision rather than Sterling's desperation. The real regeneration technology would remain here in the secure facility, protected by Guardian operatives who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to risk in direct confrontation. If James failed, if Sterling's forces overwhelmed them, the compound would be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into hands that would use it to create a world divided between the immortal elite and the disposable masses. Emma listened to the plan with growing distress, her 8-year-old mind grasping the essential danger, even if she couldn't understand all the tactical details. "But you might not come back," she said quietly. "Just like Mommy didn't come back from her drive to the store." Kane knelt down to her level, his weathered face gentle, despite the hardness that operational planning had brought to his expression. "Sometimes sweetheart people have to take risks to protect the things that matter most. Your father understands that because he spent years in the Army doing exactly that kind of work. And I understand it because I've been doing it even longer." But it was Emma's response that revealed the depth of wisdom she gained through her encounters with impossible situations and moral challenges that would have broken many adults. Then I'm going with you, she declared with absolute finality. Ranger saved us when we needed help, and now we need to save him. Families don't leave each other behind. The argument that followed was intense but brief. Kane and James both understood the tactical insanity of bringing a child into what was essentially a military operation against a heavily defended corporate fortress. But they also understood that Emma's presence would provide them with advantages that no amount of professional training could duplicate. Sterling's psychological profile suggested she was vulnerable to demonstrations of the very human connections she'd sacrificed in her pursuit of power and immortality. Seeing James risk everything to save not just his daughter, but a loyal animal might remind her of the person she'd been before desperation had twisted her into someone capable of threatening innocent lives. More pragmatically, Emma's small size and apparent innocence would allow her to move through the Nexus building in ways that armed operatives never could. Security personnel were trained to watch for adult threats, not 8-year-old girls who appeared to be visiting their father's workplace. The flight to Seattle was arranged through Guardian channels using aircraft and identification documents that would be invisible to Nexus surveillance systems. But it was during that flight that Kane revealed the full scope of what they were attempting and the price that success might demand. Sterling's board meeting is scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, he explained, as they flew through the pre-dawn darkness over the Cascade Mountains. She's planning to announce Nexus Corporation's acquisition of revolutionary medical technology that will transform the company into the most valuable enterprise in human history. The stock price surge alone will generate enough capital to fund any research project she can imagine. But Kane's intelligence files revealed a much darker purpose behind Sterling's corporate theater. The board meeting wasn't just about money or even about scientific advancement. It was about creating a public justification for the violence she was prepared to unleash if her demands weren't met. Once she announces the breakthrough to her board and the financial markets, any attempt to deny her access to the technology becomes an attack on shareholder value. He continued grimly. She's weaponizing capitalism itself, creating a situation where preventing her from obtaining immortality becomes economically treasonous. James understood the diabolical cleverness of Sterling's strategy. By making her personal survival a matter of corporate success, she was enlisting the entire economic system in her fight against anyone who would deny her what she believed she deserved. The pressure from investors, politicians, and economic interests would be overwhelming. Emma had been listening to the adult conversation with the kind of serious attention that had become characteristic of her personality since breaking her long silence. But now she spoke up with a question that cut through all the tactical and economic complexity to the heart of their moral situation. What if we told everyone the truth about what she did to Ranger? She asked simply. If people knew she hurt an innocent animal just to get something for herself, would they still want to help her? Kane and James exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the sophistication of Emma's understanding. She had identified the fundamental weakness in Sterling's position, the one vulnerability that no amount of corporate planning could address. Sterling's power depended on maintaining the illusion that she was a visionary leader, rather than someone who would torture innocent creatures to extend her own life. The Nexus Corporation headquarters dominated the Seattle skyline like a monument to corporate ambition, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun in ways that made the entire structure appear to glow with internal fire. But as their taxi approached the building, James could see the security measures that Sterling had implemented in preparation for their confrontation. Armed guards at every entrance, metal detectors sophisticated enough to identify weapons components, surveillance cameras that covered every inch of the surrounding streets. Sterling had turned her corporate fortress into exactly that, a defensive position designed to repel any assault that conventional tactics might attempt. But James wasn't planning a conventional assault. He was planning to walk through the front door carrying credentials that identified him as Alexander Reynolds, a major shareholder representing a consortium of investors interested in Nexus Corporation's medical research division. The identity was flawless, supported by financial records and corporate documentation that would withstand any background check Sterling's people might attempt. Emma would accompany him as his daughter Sarah Reynolds, a precocious child who was spending the day at her father's office while her mother attended to business elsewhere. Her cover story was simple enough to be believable and flexible enough to adapt to whatever situations they might encounter inside the building. Kane would coordinate external support, maintaining communication through encrypted channels, and ensuring that Guardian operatives were positioned to intervene if the operation went catastrophically wrong. But once James and Emma entered the Nexus building, they would be essentially on their own, dependent on their intelligence, courage, and the hope that Sterling retained enough humanity to be reached by appeals to conscience and mercy. The security checkpoint in the building's lobby was exactly as extensive as Kane's intelligence had suggested, but their false credentials passed every test with ease. James's briefcase, containing what appeared to be a sophisticated biological preservation device, drew careful scrutiny, but was ultimately cleared when the scanners detected nothing more dangerous than temperature-controlled storage equipment. The elevator ride to the 40th floor executive level felt like ascending into enemy territory, each floor they passed representing another barrier between them and any hope of escape if their deception was discovered. But Emma seemed remarkably calm, her small hand steady in James's as they watched the floor numbers climb toward their confrontation with the woman who held Ranger's life in her hands. The boardroom doors opened to reveal exactly what James had expected, a room full of well-dressed executives who radiated the kind of confident authority that came from wielding vast financial power. Sterling sat at the head of a polished conference table, her appearance as carefully controlled as ever. But James could see the signs of her deteriorating condition in the subtle tremor of her hands and the waxy quality of her skin. "Gentlemen," she announced as James and Emma entered the room, "allow me to introduce Mr. Alexander Reynolds, representing the consortium that will be funding our transition into the biotechnology sector." Mr. Reynolds has brought with him a demonstration of the revolutionary medical technology that will transform Nexus Corporation into the most valuable enterprise in the global marketplace. James placed his briefcase on the conference table and opened it with deliberate ceremony, revealing the device that Kane's technical specialists had created to fool Sterling's experts. The mock regeneration unit looked exactly like Carter's original technology, complete with the distinctive molecular storage matrix and biocontainment systems that made the real device so remarkable. But it was Emma who provided the dramatic moment that transformed the corporate presentation into something far more personal and dangerous. She stepped forward and looked directly at Sterling with the kind of moral authority that only children possessed when confronted with absolute evil. "My name isn't Sarah Reynolds," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily in the acoustically designed boardroom. "My name is Emma Mitchell, and you have my friend. His name is Ranger, and you've been hurting him to try to make my daddy give you Dr. Carter's medicine. That makes you a bad person, and bad people shouldn't get good things." The reaction in the boardroom was immediate and electric. Board members looked from Emma to Sterling to James with growing confusion and alarm. Security personnel began moving toward their positions, hands drifting toward concealed weapons. And Sterling's carefully maintained mask of corporate authority finally cracked, completely revealing the desperate dying woman beneath. "You little fool," she hissed, rising from her chair with fury that made her appear far more dangerous than her failing health should have allowed. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? This meeting represents months of preparation, millions of dollars in market positioning, the difference between life and death for someone whose contributions to science you couldn't begin to understand." But James was already in motion, his soldiers' training taking over as the situation escalated toward violence. The briefcase snapped shut, the false regeneration device secured against any attempt by Sterling's forces to claim it. Emma moved behind him with practiced ease, her small size making her difficult for security personnel to target without risking harm to her father. And then Kane's voice came through hidden speakers throughout the boardroom, his words carrying the weight of someone who had prepared for this moment for years and was finally ready to play his ultimate card. "Dr. Sterling, this is Robert Kane. You remember me, don't you? I'm the man who helped Carter disappear when you tried to steal his research the first time. I'm also the man who's been preparing for this confrontation since the day you murdered him to get access to his sanctuary." The revelation hit the boardroom like an explosion. Kane wasn't just a Guardian operative or even Emma's grandfather. He was a witness to Sterling's greatest crime, someone who could testify to her direct involvement in Carter's death and her willingness to commit murder to obtain the regeneration technology. But it was Kane's final words that transformed the tactical situation completely and revealed the true price he was prepared to pay to ensure their victory. "I want you to know, Sterling, that while you've been wasting time with corporate theater, I've been analyzing Ranger's blood. Carter was right about the regenerative compound being irreplaceable, but he was wrong about one crucial detail. The real secret isn't in the technology itself. It's in Ranger's modified biology, and I've just finished synthesizing everything we need from samples I collected years ago. The implications were staggering and immediate. If Kane had successfully reverse-engineered the regeneration process from Ranger's enhanced physiology, then Sterling's desperate pursuit of the original compound was pointless. The technology could be reproduced, distributed, used to help humanity, rather than enslaved to serve corporate greed. But Kane's triumph came at a price that James saw immediately in the tactical displays that flickered to life around the boardroom. Sterling's security forces were converging on Kane's location, and the older man was making no attempt to escape or defend himself. He was buying them time with his life, ensuring that James and Emma could complete their mission, even if it cost him everything he had left to give. The war for humanity's future had entered its final phase, and the price of victory was about to be paid in full. Kane's sacrifice bought them precious seconds, but James knew that time was running out with each breath Sterling took in the chaos of the collapsing board meeting. The corporate executives were scrambling toward exits, their comfortable world of profit margins and market projections shattered by the revelation that they'd been funding a woman who tortured innocent animals and murdered scientists to extend her own life. Sterling herself had abandoned all pretense of corporate civility, her deteriorating condition making her movements erratic and desperate as she screamed orders to security personnel who were struggling to process the complete breakdown of what should have been a routine corporate presentation. But it was the sound coming through the building's intercom system that made everyone in the boardroom freeze with sudden understanding. Ranger's howl echoed through the Nexus headquarters, transmitted from wherever Sterling's people were holding him, a sound of pain and terror that spoke to something primal in every person who heard it. Emma's reaction was immediate, and heartbreaking tears streaming down her face as she recognized the voice of the loyal companion who had saved their lives. "You're killing him," she said to Sterling, with the kind of absolute moral authority that only children possessed when confronted with pure evil. "Just like you killed Carter. Just like you're trying to kill my grandpa. You hurt everyone who tries to help people because you only care about yourself." Sterling's response revealed the complete extent of her psychological breakdown. She laughed, a sound that carried no humor but rather the brittle hysteria of someone who had lost everything that connected her to ordinary human feeling. "Your grandfather's heroic gesture changes nothing, child. Even if he synthesized a crude approximation of the regeneration compound from animal blood, I still have the original research data, the complete technical specifications, and most importantly, I have leverage that will ensure your cooperation." The building's security systems activated with military precision, blast barriers sliding into place over windows and exits, transforming the executive floor into a sealed fortress. Sterling had triggered lockdown protocols that turned the corporate headquarters into a prison, trapping everyone inside while her private security forces implemented whatever final solution she had prepared for this moment. Emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red as Sterling moved to a concealed wall panel that opened to reveal a sophisticated command console. Her fingers worked across controls with practiced ease, bringing up displays that showed not just the Nexus building, but locations across the Pacific Northwest where her corporate assets had been positioned for exactly this kind of contingency. "Behold the true scope of what you've chosen to interfere with," she announced to the terrified board members and the scattered security personnel. "Project Phoenix isn't just about extending my life. It's about ensuring that if I cannot have immortality, then no one else will have the opportunity to mock death the way Samuel Carter's research makes possible." The displays showed chemical processing plants, research facilities, and storage depots that James recognized from his military briefings as targets that could cause catastrophic environmental damage if destroyed. Sterling hadn't just been preparing to threaten individual lives. She had positioned herself to commit ecological terrorism on a scale that would poison entire watersheds and render vast areas of the country uninhabitable for decades. Emma stared at the displays with growing horror, her 8-year-old mind struggling to comprehend the scope of destruction that one person's selfishness could unleash upon the world. But when she spoke, her words carried the simple clarity that had been her strength throughout their impossible journey. "You're not just a bad person," she said to Sterling with devastating directness. "You're the worst person. Even if you can't live forever, there are good people who deserve to live their regular lives. And you want to take that away from them just because you're angry." Sterling's reaction to Emma's moral condemnation was swift and violent. She moved toward the child with inhuman speed, her deteriorating cellular structure somehow granting her moments of enhanced physical capability. But James was already in motion, his combat training taking over as every protective instinct he possessed focused on a single imperative. No one threatens his daughter, not corporations, not desperate scientists, not anyone who believed that their personal needs justified harming innocent people. The fight that followed was brief but decisive. Sterling's enhanced strength was real, but it was also unstable, her cellular breakdown, causing unpredictable fluctuations in her physical capabilities. James had faced enhanced combatants in Afghanistan, enemies who used chemical stimulants to push their bodies beyond normal human limits, and he'd learned that such advantages always came with corresponding weaknesses. Sterling's weakness was her desperation itself, the way her need for survival made her predictable in her attacks and careless about her defenses. When James struck, it wasn't with the brutal efficiency of someone trying to kill an enemy. It was with the precise control of a medic who understood exactly how much force was needed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Sterling collapsed, her enhanced physiology finally succumbing to the cellular instability that had been consuming her for months. But as she fell, her hand found a dead man's switch that would trigger the ecological catastrophe she'd threatened. The destruction would begin in 30 minutes, enough time for her to regain consciousness and witness the beginning of her revenge against a world that had refused to give her what she believed she deserved. Emma was already moving toward the command console, her small fingers working across controls with the same fearless determination she'd shown throughout their journey. But the security systems were designed to resist tampering, requiring biometric identification from authorized personnel to prevent exactly the kind of interference she was attempting. That's when the building's intercom system crackled to life again, but this time the voice that emerged wasn't Ranger's howl of pain. It was Kane's voice, weak but determined, transmitted from whatever location Sterling's forces had taken him to after his capture. Emma, sweetheart, listen carefully to Grandpa's voice. I'm in the medical facility on the 32nd floor, and I've found our four-legged friend. But more importantly, I've accessed Sterling's research computers, and I know how to stop what she started. James felt hope blazing in his chest as Kane continued his transmission, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Sterling's Phoenix protocol requires continuous authorization from the command center where you are now. If we can interrupt the signal for more than 5 minutes, the automated systems will interpret it as a malfunction and abort the destruction sequence. But interrupting the signal would require shutting down the building's main power systems, which would also disable the life support equipment that was keeping Kane alive in the medical facility. James understood immediately what his father-in-law was proposing and the terrible choice it represented. Emma seemed to understand as well, because when she spoke into the intercom system, her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned far too much about sacrifice and loss in her short life. Grandpa, if we turn off the power, will you be okay? Kane's laugh came through the speakers, gentle and filled with the kind of love that grandparents reserve for the children who represented their hopes for the future. Sweetheart, I've been dying slowly for 3 years ever since your mother's accident. But today I get to choose how that story ends. I get to make sure that the granddaughter I love, more than life itself, grows up in a world where good people can still make a difference. The silence that followed was broken by another sound, one that made Emma's face light up with joy, despite the gravity of their situation. Ranger's bark echoed through the building, no longer the howl of pain they had heard before, but the confident sound of a healthy, happy dog who had found his pack again. Kane's voice returned warmer now, and filled with quiet satisfaction. I've administered the synthesized regeneration compound to Ranger. His enhanced physiology allowed him to process it more efficiently than we hoped, and he's already showing signs of complete recovery. Whatever Sterling did to him, it's been undone. James looked at his daughter, seeing in her determined expression the same strength that had carried Sarah through the challenges of building a life separate from the dangerous world she'd been born into. Emma was Sarah's daughter in every way that mattered, possessed of the moral courage to make impossible choices when the stakes were high enough to demand them. Do it, Daddy, she said quietly. Grandpa's right. Some things are more important than being safe. James moved to the main power controls, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. As he reached for the shutdown switches, Kane's voice came through the intercom one final time, carrying a message that James knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Tell Emma that her mother would be proud of the person she's becoming. Tell her that sometimes the best way to honor the people we've lost is to make sure their sacrifices meant something. And tell her that love doesn't end just because someone goes away. The power died throughout the Nexus building, plunging them into darkness that was broken only by emergency lighting and the pale glow of Seattle's skyline visible through the sealed windows. In the medical facility, 32 floors below the equipment that had been sustaining Kane's life, fell silent, and Robert Kane closed his eyes for the final time, secure in the knowledge that his granddaughter would inherit a world where corporate greed couldn't triumph over human decency. Emma cried then the tears of a child who understood that love sometimes required letting go of the people who mattered most. But when the building's emergency power systems restored minimal lighting 5 minutes later, confirming that Sterling's Phoenix protocol had been successfully aborted, she wiped her eyes and stood straighter, ready to face whatever came next. The medical facility's doors opened 20 minutes later, revealing Ranger limping, but alive, his coat gleaming with health despite the ordeal he'd endured. The loyal German shepherd moved directly to Emma, pressing his massive head against her small body in a gesture of comfort that spoke to bonds deeper than species barriers. Sterling herself survived her cellular breakdown, halted by emergency medical intervention that stabilized her condition without granting her the enhanced longevity she'd sought. She would face trial for conspiracy, corporate espionage, and the murder of Dr. Ron. Samuel Carter spending whatever remained of her natural lifespan in federal prison, where her scientific brilliance would be channeled toward research projects designed to benefit humanity rather than exploit it. The regeneration technology that Carter had died protecting was placed under international oversight, administered by a coalition of medical organizations and humanitarian groups that included many former members of the Guardian Network. The promise of extended life and enhanced healing would be realized gradually, carefully, with safeguards designed to ensure that the benefits reached those who needed them most, rather than those who could simply afford them. 6 months later, James Mitchell stood on the porch of a comfortable house in the Montana wilderness, watching Emma play in the yard with Ranger, both of them healthy and happy, in ways that seemed almost miraculous after everything they'd endured. The house sat on 20 acres of pristine mountain landscape, purchased with funds that Kane had left in trust for his granddaughter's future. Emma had returned to school, but she was no longer the silent, traumatized child who had retreated into herself after her mother's death. She was curious, engaged, and possessed of a moral clarity that impressed teachers and classmates alike. She spoke often about her grandfather keeping his memory alive through stories that emphasized his courage and dedication to protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. James himself had found purpose beyond anything he'd experienced since leaving the Army. The Guardian Network had offered him Kane's position, coordinating protection for researchers and activists who faced threats from corporate and government forces that would suppress breakthrough technologies for political or economic advantage. It was dangerous work, but it was also meaningful in ways that construction jobs and disability checks had never been. The foreclosure notice that had once seemed like the end of the world was now a distant memory, replaced by the deed to property that would provide Emma with security and stability throughout her childhood and beyond. But more importantly, she had something that no amount of money could purchase: the knowledge that she belonged to a family that stood up for what was right regardless of personal cost. On quiet evenings like this one, when the Montana sky painted itself in colors that reminded James of his wife's favorite dress, Emma would sit beside him on the porch swing and ask questions about the future. Would there be other people like Sterling who needed to be stopped? Would the regeneration technology really help sick children get better? Would they see Kane again someday, in whatever place good people went? When their time on Earth was finished, James couldn't answer all of her questions, but he could give her the one thing that mattered most: the certainty that there would always be people willing to fight for justice, to protect the innocent, and to ensure that scientific advancement served the cause of human flourishing rather than human exploitation. Ranger would live for decades more, his enhanced physiology granting him the kind of extended companionship that most people could only dream of sharing with their beloved pets. But more than that, he would live as a symbol of what Carter's research had truly been about: not the pursuit of immortality for its own sake, but the extension of life for those who use that gift to make the world a better place. As the stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, Emma leaned against her father's shoulder and spoke the words that had become their evening ritual. Tell me again about Grandpa's last message. James repeated Cain's final words, as he had every night since returning to the mountains that had become their true home. Love doesn't end just because someone goes away. It lives on in the choices we make, the people we help, and the legacy we leave for those who come after us. Emma nodded with the solemn understanding of someone far older than her 8 years. And then, as she did every night, she added her own conclusion to the story that had transformed them, all from victims of circumstance into guardians of the future. That's why we have to keep being good people, Daddy. Because the people we love are still watching, and they want to be proud of what we do with the time we have left. In the darkness beyond the porch light, Ranger lifted his head and gave a single soft bark of agreement. Some truths were too important for words, but they could be felt in the beating of hearts that refused to give up, in the bonds that connected families across the boundaries of species and mortality, and in the quiet determination of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when the world needed heroes. The Guardian's secret had been revealed not as a formula for immortality, but as a reminder that the most important discoveries weren't technological, but moral, the understanding that love, courage, and sacrifice were the only forces powerful enough to transform the world, one life at a time, one choice at a time, one family at a time. And in the Montana wilderness, where ancient mountains watched over new beginnings, that transformation continued with each sunrise, as bright and enduring as the hope that good people carried in their hearts.